If you were to step onto the cobblestone streets of Paris in the late 1700s, the first thing you might notice would not be the architecture, not the grand sweeping facades of the aristocratic townhouses, not even the Gothic shadows of Notre Dame against a winter dusk. No, what would catch your eye was movement, the flick of a fan, the way a ribbon was tied, the way a gloved hand rested just so on a parasol. Paris was noisy, overcrowded, and delightfully nosy, and for those who knew where to look, the city spoke an unspoken language, a language written not in ink, but in the quiet code of clothes and gestures. By the mid-18th century, Paris was a hive of coded communication. Servants used subtle signals to communicate during banquets. Aristocrats could insult each other without ever raising their voices. And on certain streets, particularly in the neighborhoods just beyond the well-lit boulevards, prostitutes used their own private vocabulary of signs, colors, and fabrics to identify themselves to the right kind of client, while avoiding the wrong kind of attention. Of course, if you were a visitor, perhaps a merchant from Lyon, or an ambitious clerk sent from Versailles, you might not notice at first. You'd walk past a woman in a powdered wig, her gown modestly cut, and think nothing of her. But a local, they would see the angle of her fan, the exact shade of the ribbon at her neck, and know instantly. Paris, at the time, was obsessed with etiquette. Even in its seedier corners, manners were a weapon, a way of speaking without speaking. Prostitutes had long been punished for being too obvious. Brothels were regulated, at least in theory, and public women risked arrest if they loitered where they weren't supposed to. But clever women found a way to advertise in plain sight. The fan was a popular tool. To hold it open in the left hand could mean, "I am available." To close it sharply might mean, "Not you." To tap the closed fan against the lips, well, that was an invitation no one could misinterpret. Gloves could work the same way. Removing one slowly might be a gesture to a familiar client. Wearing a specific embroidery pattern on the cuff could hint at price or services, all without saying a word. And Paris loved a secret. Gossip was its lifeblood. From the royal court to the wine shops of the Rue Saint-Honoré, everyone was fluent in innuendo. In this city, coded gestures were as much a part of daily life as bread and wine. You could spend the afternoon at a cafe and watch entire conversations happen without a single word. The tilt of a hat, the way a shoe tapped against the paving stones, it was all part of a performance. But in the narrow lanes where lantern light faded into shadow, the performance was about survival. For these women, signals were not just about attracting clients, they were about safety. The right glance could mean a potential protector was nearby. The wrong one could warn of a police raid. So, imagine yourself there. It's a warm evening in 1784. The air smells faintly of roasting chestnuts and horse manure, Paris's most reliable perfume. You're walking along the Rue de la Ferronnerie, where shadows stretch long between flickering street lamps. A woman in a pale blue gown passes you, her powdered hair piled high, a single crimson ribbon tied around her neck. You think nothing of it, until she drops her fan slightly, holding it at an angle that you've never seen before. She glances at you just once, and then keeps walking. In a city where everyone seemed to be watching everyone else, you've just been spoken to in a language you don't yet understand. And that's where our story begins. Because once you start noticing these signals, you realize how layered 18th century Paris really was. Every cafe had its own code, every street corner had its own rules, and in the hidden economy of the night, these gestures meant the difference between profit and prison. Oh, before we go further, if you're enjoying this slow walk through history, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, and subscribe for more of these strange but true stories from the past. Now, let's decode this secret language, gesture by gesture, fan by fan, glove by glove. If you were walking through Paris in the 1700s, you could learn a lot without hearing a single word. And if you were listening to the right sort of silence, you might just learn too much. Because for those who worked in Paris's shadow economy, the women who offered company for coin, language could be a dangerous thing. Spoken words could be overheard by police, by priests, by jealous rivals, or worse, by a wife who happened to be in the wrong street at the wrong time. So a new language bloomed, not written in books, not whispered in back rooms, but played out in public, in full daylight, right under the noses of the city's most respectable citizens. It was a language of movement, the way a hand fluttered, a head tilted, a feather quivered in a hat. To a casual passerby, it was nothing more than a moment's fidget, but to those who knew the code, it was as obvious as an open invitation. The fan was the first weapon of choice. No, not for stabbing, for speaking. Paris in the 18th century was a city obsessed with fans. They were fashion, they were flirting tools, they were shields for the mouth when whispering secrets, they were cooling devices in summer, or at least a stylish way to pretend the heat wasn't unbearable, and the women of Paris's demi-monde knew how to use them better than anyone. A fan opened halfway and held just below the chin. That could mean I'm available, but you are not my only option today. A slow, rhythmic tap against the lips. Follow me, but don't be obvious about it. Snapping the fan closed and tucking it under the arm. We've finished here. Go away. Even the speed of movement mattered. A lazy, slow flutter meant I have time. A sharp, crisp flick could be impatience or warning. One police report from 1761 mentions an officer following a woman who communicated with 5 men by the use of a folding fan without speaking to any of them. He couldn't decode it, but her customers could. Hats were the second part of the code. By the 1750s, hats in Paris had become elaborate enough to be conversation pieces on their own. Ostrich plumes, velvet ribbons, flowers made of silk, lace trimmings, some looked like small gardens balanced on the head, and within this frippery, a whole vocabulary could hide. A wide-brimmed hat pulled low over one eye wasn't just dramatic flair, it meant the deal is already made. A subtle, sudden adjustment of the brim while making deliberate eye contact. You have my attention, for now. Tilting the hat slightly backward could be a signal to approach, while a slight twist sideways could signal a polite refusal without a single word spoken. Some women carried 2 different hats with them, switching them out at certain points in the day as a signal that their availability had changed. To the unknowing, it was just a matter of fashion. To the initiated, it was business strategy. Gloves, too, had their messages. A woman slowly drawing a glove fingertip by fingertip wasn't just undressing her hand, she was sending an invitation. Pulling gloves on while speaking to someone could mean I am not interested in you, tapping the rolled up gloves in the palm of the hand. A silent wait for me. Even earrings could speak. A casual touch to a pearl could be a pre-arranged signal for a meeting place. Adjusting the clasp while looking across the street. A call to follow discreetly. The beauty of this silent language was its invisibility. A constable on patrol might walk straight past a dozen exchanges and be none the wiser. A jealous wife could see her husband tip his hat and think nothing of it. And in a city where conversation traveled faster than carriages, such invisibility was worth more than gold. But like any language, it had to be learned. Newcomers to the trade were often schooled by older women, sometimes in private rooms above taverns, sometimes in public squares under the guise of sewing lessons. They'd practice the conversation in front of mirrors until each gesture was second nature. And this wasn't just for show. In certain streets, especially around the Palais-Royal, a missed signal could cost you a night's earnings, or worse, give your customer to a rival. There are whispered stories of disputes fought entirely in gestures. One might see 2 women on opposite sides of the Rue Saint-Honoré, standing motionless, except for the flick of their fans, the tilt of their heads, the occasional tap of a heel. To the untrained eye, it looked like 2 fashionable women resting in the shade. To those who understood, it was a duel, a silent battle for territory, each gesture aimed to claim or warn off passing men. In some cases, a bystander could even become a pawn in this unspoken contest. A man, entirely oblivious, might find himself claimed by one woman's coded glance, only to be rescued moments later by another with a sharper signal. This quiet theatre played out against the noisy backdrop of Paris. The creak of cartwheels, the chatter of market vendors, the clink of cups in coffee houses, the faint tolling of church bells, all while, in the spaces between, these silent sentences passed back and forth like secret letters carried on the air. And like any performance, it relied on its audience knowing their part. The women spoke in glances and gestures. The men, those who understood, replied in kind. A touch to a cane, a deliberate pause to light a pipe, a quick lift of the hat brim, and business was done without a syllable spoken. It was, in its own way, a dance, a dangerous, profitable, and utterly Parisian dance. If the streets of Paris were a stage, then the Palais-Royal was its most scandalous theatre. It was here, under the long arcades and behind the tall shuttered windows, that pleasure business was conducted with all the elegance of a royal court and all the cunning of a marketplace. The Palais-Royal was not simply a palace, it was an entire enclosed world: gardens, arcades lined with shops, coffee houses, bookstalls, gaming rooms, and discreet entrances to rooms where the real deals were made. The air smelled of roasting coffee, damp stone, candle wax, and perfume, the mingled scent of commerce and temptation, and within its covered walkways, the language of Paris's prostitutes reached a level of sophistication found nowhere else in the city. Here, gestures didn't just signal availability, they carried more precise meaning: prices, time limits, even the particular services on offer, all disguised as idle fidgets. A woman might pause at the edge of a colonnade and adjust the ribbon at her throat. That could mean 1 hour. A tilt of the head toward the garden's central fountain might mean, meet me there in 10 minutes. A languid stroke of a gloved hand down the side of a silk skirt could suggest something altogether more daring. The Palais-Royal was a place where every move was observed, but not always understood. Men of every rank, from powdered courtiers to provincial merchants, came to walk its covered galleries, each pretending they were only there to browse books or sample the latest porcelain from Limoges. Yet they walked a little slower when certain women appeared, women whose gowns were just slightly too fashionable for their supposed income, women who never seemed to shop for anything, yet spent hours drifting from arcade to arcade. One memoir from the 1780s recalls a young officer who thought himself immune to these games. He strolled the arcades in full uniform, ignoring every coy glance, every fluttering fan. Then, as he passed a bookstall, a woman standing in the shade touched her earring and looked away. It was nothing, a simple adjustment. Or so he told himself. 5 minutes later, he found himself in a rented room above a nearby cafe, having entirely forgotten the book he had meant to buy. The Palais-Royal offered another advantage to the coded language: anonymity in plain sight. Outside in the streets, a man seen lingering with a known prostitute might face whispers or worse. Inside the arcades, however, everyone lingered. Merchants haggling over silk prices, philosophers debating Rousseau, children tugging their mothers towards sweet stalls. If a man paused to exchange a glance with a woman here, it could mean anything. And so the women of the Palais-Royal flourished, weaving their messages into the fabric of ordinary life. For newcomers to the trade, this was both exciting and terrifying. The arcades had a rhythm, a choreography that had to be learned: where to stand for the best visibility, when to walk slowly, when to appear busy so as not to draw suspicion. Older women acted as guides, teaching not only the gestures but the timing. A glance given too soon might lose a client to a competitor too late, and the opportunity would vanish into the crowd. Some women kept mental maps of the gardens, knowing precisely where the lamplight fell at certain hours, which benches were in shadow, which doors led to staircases rather than broom closets. These details were currency as valuable as the language itself. But the Palais-Royal was not without its dangers. The very density of people made it easier for pickpockets to work, and not just the ordinary kind. Rivals could steal a client as deftly as a thief might steal a purse. A wrong signal spotted by the wrong woman could set off a silent war of blocking, intercepting, and subtle insults delivered with a mere flick of the fan. Police patrols also kept a watchful eye, especially after sunset. While they rarely arrested women for standing in the arcades, they could, and did, expel anyone they suspected of solicitation. This was why the language had to remain so layered, so careful. For the seasoned practitioners though, this cat-and-mouse game was part of the charm. It wasn't enough to simply be beautiful. In the Palais-Royal, you had to be clever. You had to read people as well as you read the code. You had to spot the hesitant man who might need encouragement, the impulsive one who could be caught with a single glance, the boastful one whose money was better spent elsewhere. And above all, you had to remember that this was not a private space. At any moment, an innocent passerby or a wife might appear. Your face could never betray more than polite indifference, even when your gestures spoke entire paragraphs. By the last light of day, as the shadows lengthened under the arcades and the lamps flickered to life, the language of the Palais-Royal became even richer. In the dim glow, a movement had to be slower to be seen, a gesture more deliberate to be understood. The crowd thinned, making every encounter stand out. And in those twilight hours, with the perfume of the garden's last roses hanging in the air, and the sound of distant music drifting from a salon window, the women of the Palais-Royal spoke their silent sentences to the men who understood them, and to no one else. Because in this place, secrets were never shouted, they were shown. Ask ChatGPT. For many women, in 18th-century Paris, the problem wasn't attracting clients, it was surviving the attention. Prostitution, though widespread, was officially condemned. The church called it sinful, the law called it disorderly, and the police called it their business. Street arrests were not rare. A constable could detain a woman for something as vague as public indecency, and no jury needed to hear the case. A few angry wives, or a single disapproving neighbor, could ruin a woman's livelihood overnight. In this climate, words were dangerous. A careless phrase spoken in the wrong ear could be repeated, recorded, and turned into evidence. So the silent language wasn't just about elegance or style, it was about protection. The Paris police archives contain pages upon pages of reports from officers who watched women for hours, trying to catch them in the act of soliciting. Many failed. They'd write frustrated notes, like observed her standing in the arcade for 2 hours, no words spoken. Yet several men entered the cafe with her. These women had learned to make an invitation without making a sound, and to make refusal just as invisible. A simple turn of the shoulder, the tightening of a shawl, a fan snapped shut, all said no without attracting attention. It was a skill that could save a woman from prison. There was also a second danger: informants. Paris's moral police paid certain women to spy on others, reporting names, locations, and arrangements. No one could be certain who was watching. Even friends could be tempted into betrayal, for the promise of a reduced fine or a warm bed in the police lodgings instead of a cold cell. This made the coded gestures not only efficient but selective. They weren't just for attracting clients, they were for screening them. A man who didn't respond correctly to the signal could be ignored, no matter how much money he might offer. Some of the codes even had built-in decoys. A woman might make a gesture that looked like an invitation to an unknowing man, but was actually a warning to another woman across the street. This way, if questioned, she could truthfully say she hadn't spoken to anyone and hadn't even made an overture to the man in question. The language also allowed for entire conversations in motion. Imagine a woman walking slowly through a market. She brushes her fingers over her fan twice. "I am free." She shifts her hat brim while glancing at a particular stall. "Meet me there." The man nods slightly, and pauses to inspect fruit. I understand. From there, both could go their separate ways, meeting later in a place where no one would connect the two. For customers, this language offered something too: discretion. Men who wanted company often feared public humiliation. A loud offer could be overheard, repeated, or, in the worst case, overheard by a wife's cousin who just happened to be passing by. By speaking without words, both parties could shield themselves. Even in the middle of a crowded street, their conversation was a private one. But this privacy had its costs. Misinterpretation could lead to embarrassment, or worse. A signal given too casually might be mistaken for an invitation. A genuine approach could be missed entirely if the client wasn't looking at the right moment. There are stories in the memoirs of Paris's courtesans of missed opportunities that were almost comical. One tells of a wealthy silk merchant who followed a woman half the length of the Rue Saint-Honoré, convinced she had invited him, only to realize when she turned into a church that she had merely been scratching an itch behind her ear. The women learned to make their signals distinct without ever making them obvious. It was a balancing act, a constant refinement of style, and refinement mattered. The language wasn't only about avoiding the police. It was about status. The more elegant and subtle a woman's signals, the more she seemed to belong to a higher class of clientele. Crude gestures were for street corners, refined ones were for arcades, coffee houses, and theater entrances. Some of the more famous women became known not just for their beauty, but for their fluency in the code. They could carry on entire negotiations in the space of a few glances, leaving their clients dazzled before a single word passed between them. The language became so refined, in fact, that by the late 18th century it began to bleed into high society itself. Well-bred ladies borrowed a few of the more harmless gestures, a slow fan wave here, a particular head tilt there, for flirtation at balls and salons. Of course, these society ladies didn't use them for business. But in a delicious irony, the same aristocrat who clucked her tongue about immoral women in the streets might at a masquerade ball mimic their signals in order to tempt a dance partner closer. And so, the language of prostitutes in 18th-century Paris lived a double life, shielding the women who depended on it, entertaining the men who benefited from it, and quietly, elegantly, seeping into the very society that claimed to despise it. Because in a city like Paris, even the most scandalous secrets have a way of becoming fashionable if they are beautiful enough. By the last decades of the 18th century, the silent language of Paris's prostitutes was no longer a hidden curiosity. It had become fashionable. What began as a secret code to avoid the police had slipped into salons, coffee houses, and even the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. Everyone seemed to want a piece of it, though like most things copied by the upper classes, they liked it better without the inconvenient parts about survival and rent money. At masked balls, noble women fluttered their fans with studied care, borrowing the same movements that street women had once used to signal clients. The difference, for them it was just another game, a way to make the most interesting man in the room cross the floor and ask for a dance. Gentlemen too began to play with the code. A quick touch to a cravat or a deliberate pause to light a pipe, once meant to confirm a rendezvous, became fashionable flourishes among the foppish young men who liked to think of themselves as dangerous. Of course, the original practitioners watched this with a mixture of amusement and annoyance. The gestures that had once kept them out of jail were now being imitated by people who would never face such risks. It was like watching someone wear a soldier's uniform to a costume party, flattering but faintly insulting. There were moments when the two worlds collided. A courtesan in the Palais-Royal might exchange a coded glance with a merchant, only to be interrupted by a bored young aristocrat mimicking the same gesture as a joke. Sometimes, this led to awkward confrontations. Other times, it led to entirely new business arrangements. And then there were the blurred lines, the women who began as salon hostesses or actresses and gradually stepped into the demi-monde, using the language as their bridge. For them, the code wasn't just about safety or secrecy, it was a calling card, a way to signal their sophistication as much as their availability. Theatres, in particular, became a fertile ground for this shared vocabulary. In the dimly lit corridors between acts, fans opened and closed with deliberate rhythm. Glances darted between boxes. A dropped handkerchief might be retrieved by a man who knew exactly what that meant, or by a confused usher who thought he was just being helpful. The most skilled women could use the setting to their advantage. A flick of the fan at a dramatic moment on stage meant the gesture would go unnoticed by the audience, but not by the man in the third row who was watching her more than the play. Coffee houses and gaming rooms picked up the code as well. By the 1790s, even the most respectable cafes had their share of subtle exchanges happening over the clink of porcelain cups. Not every signal in these places was sexual. Some were for passing information, arranging business deals, or even warning of approaching trouble. This blending of meanings made the language even more slippery for outsiders. Was that woman tilting her hat because she was interested, or because the sun was in her eyes? Was that man tapping his cane to signal a meeting, or just impatient for his coffee? And perhaps that was the greatest strength of the code, its plausible deniability. No one could ever prove what a gesture meant unless both parties agreed. A fan was, after all, just a fan. A hat brim was just a hat brim. This was what allowed the language to survive when so many other street-born customs were stamped out by authority. It couldn't be banned because it could always be explained away. As the revolution approached and the old order began to crumble, the coded language took on new layers. It wasn't just about love or lust anymore, it became a tool for survival in a city growing more dangerous by the day. Courtesans and their clients weren't the only ones using it now. Messengers passed through the streets with the same careful glances and signals, some carrying information far more treacherous than a meeting time. In a city where words could condemn you to the guillotine, silence became its own form of resistance. By then, it was hard to tell where the original code ended and its many imitations began. The aristocrat fanning herself at the opera might not realize she was echoing a gesture invented decades earlier by a woman trying to avoid arrest. The soldier tipping his hat in the Palais-Royal might not know he was borrowing a signal once used to set the price of an evening, but the women who had built the language from the start, the ones who had whispered it into existence with every flick of the wrist, every turn of the head, they remembered. Because for them, it had never been just about romance or even money. It had been about the right to speak without speaking, and that, in 18th-century Paris, was the most dangerous luxury of all.